Okay, thank you for all coming today. I'd like to welcome you to the English lecture series. This is the beginning of the fall lecture series, and this is a special lecture today. This is lecture number 40, and we are very pleased and very honored to welcome Mr. David Schlaefer. He is the chief of the Political Military Affairs section of the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. He is visiting us on a brief visit to this area, and we are very fortunate to have him here today. So his topic is the U.S.-Japan alliance. Please welcome Mr. David Schlaefer.
Thank you so much, guys. I understand that this is an English language lecture series, so we are okay with English. Is that correct? We have Japanese native speakers here, so I will try to speak a little more slowly than usual. I have a tendency to speak quickly and to pay attention to vocabulary, but please interrupt me and just raise your hand if there's something that you don't understand, and I'll try to explain in Japanese. Or one of my colleagues, Yuko-san from Embassy Tokyo, and Kao-san from Sapporo Consulate can help also. 私は昨年横浜に住んでいて、日本語を勉強しました。1年間、ほとんど1年間、日本語を勉強しました。それから、私はこの Language Student Dynamic 分かりました。ちょっと難しかったです。So I understand how difficult it is to study another language for a long period of time, especially Japanese. Wow. Thank you once again for having me here to speak with you all. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and a little bit about what I do at the embassy and what our section does at Embassy Tokyo. And then we have a PowerPoint presentation on the alliance in general, and I will run through that and give you a few details there. I may not use this 100%. I may digress a little bit. Oops. There we go. This is a little too far ahead, all right? Advanced view. You want to help out here, Yuko? If we somehow get all the way to the middle. Okay, here we go. And then afterward, we can have Q's and A's and discussion. And also, we don't have to only talk about security issues. If you all have questions in general, really about any aspect of U.S. foreign policy or Nichibei Kankei or U.S. elections or anything like that, I'm pleased to speak about that. If it's not my area, maybe something very detailed about the TPP economic negotiations or whatever, I'll just let you know that I don't know about that and I can't respond to it. And also for today, I would like to speak as frankly as possible and not have to speak in talking points or in that type of canned language. So I think we can all agree that this is off the record and I'm speaking more as a political scientist or as a political analyst as opposed to an official representative of the embassy and someone who is giving this type of official presentation. And that way we can be a little more frank about certain issues. So to start off with, David Schlaefer. I am the Director for Political and Military Affairs at the American Embassy at Embassy Tokyo. I have been in place since July. The Political Military Affairs section is part of our overall political section at Embassy Tokyo. And the American Embassy in Tokyo is one of the biggest embassies that we have. 200 Americans, we say, about 300 Japanese staff, so maybe about 500 people altogether. As far as the American staff goes, you have every office and every agency of the federal government that you can imagine is represented at Embassy Tokyo. There are tax people from the Internal Revenue Service. There is a Library of Congress representative whose job is to acquire periodicals, books, etc. There are transportation department people, Homeland Security. There are economists, commercial service representatives. doing business. There are agricultural service representatives working on various ag issues. And then a lot of foreign service officers like myself. And we're divided up into functional specializations. So I'm a political officer. Yuko and our colleagues are local Japanese political specialists. We have public affairs foreign service officers, econ foreign service officers. Perhaps many of you are most familiar with consular officers. If you're an American citizen, then you have to deal with getting your passport renewed, you get married abroad, you get a certificate, you had a child abroad, you get a report of birth abroad. If you get in trouble, the person you wind up calling is a consular officer at an American consulate like the one in Sapporo or the embassy. So quite a few people do that kind of work. And then the consular officers also are involved with services for Japanese citizens. So visa services, immigrant visa services, fiancé visa services, a whole bunch of other stuff. They're really the busiest people, and they certainly have the best stories, I think. Political officer like myself, again, I focus on security issues. We have 6 officers, American officers, in the political military affairs section. 3 local specialists, Japanese specialists who work with us. And that's probably just about the largest political military affairs section that we have in the world, except for Baghdad, maybe Embassy Kabul, which right now are these embassies on steroids because of the wars there and because of the conflicts there. I actually served in Iraq right before I came here, and we just have hundreds and hundreds of people all over the country, everywhere. Here in Japan, my section deals, so it's a little unusual for a foreign service officer. I work about 50% of my time with Japanese, with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense, usually, on security issues. And about half of my time I work with U.S. Forces Japan. I work with Americans, with our uniformed service colleagues. Air Force, Navy, mainly out at Yokota Air Force Base. But for example, 2 days ago, the main reason we came up here was to go to Misawa so that I could have consultations with the commander and the deputy commander at the U.S. Air Force Base in Misawa. So it's a little different for a diplomat, for a foreign service officer, to spend so much of her time or his time working with U.S. bureaucracy and U.S. interagency affairs, as opposed to working directly with the Japanese. But we do that because of the U.S.-Japan alliance. It's arguably the most important security alliance, military alliance that we have anywhere in the world. It is really the oldest alliance, with the exception of NATO, which is a very different kind of thing that we have with any country. And we think that it's a tremendous success story after World War II. If you think about the conflict that Japan and the United States went through, you think about the tremendous impact that that had on Japan. What a tragic event it was for both countries, ending with the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan absolutely devastated, 400,000 American soldiers dead after this terrible conflict. The fact that the two countries were able to slowly, and it didn't happen that quickly at first, come together, work together in the process of rebuilding, form this alliance that has withstood a couple of generations now, going on almost 70 years, to become the relationship that it is today. It's really kind of, historically speaking, it's an amazing story that two peoples and two countries that had so much enmity, so much mutual hostility at one point, have able to evolve together beyond that, and economically and socially, and as far as our security alliance, come together as closely as our countries are. It's really a neat thing, and it's really a cool thing. It's something that every single one of us at the embassy, is kind of aware of all the time as we're going about our daily interactions with our Japanese counterparts, and it makes our job really exciting, and it's a really nice place to work for us because of that. So going into the alliance, you can see President Obama, NODA, And we'll start off with some history and background. And here is President Eisenhower. The alliance treaty that we refer to is the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security. It was signed in 1960. It was very controversial at the time. Many people in the United States, they really don't even know the history behind the treaty now. I don't know if in Japan it is more widely understood how controversial the treaty was at the time. Japan was already starting to rebuild at this time. It had received a tremendous amount of assistance from the United States, but of course Japan was also still basically an occupied country. There was very, very strong opposition in many quarters in 1960 to signing a defense treaty with the United States. Part of it was because Japan had gone through this terrible conflict and this terrible war, and the Japanese people were afraid that if they signed an alliance with the United States, they would be drawn into a future conflict with the Soviet Union, right? The US and the Soviet Union would inevitably go to war in some way, and Japan was going to get sucked in because it was a US ally. So part of it was that concern and fear on the part of Japanese people. Part of it still with an older generation than perhaps bad feelings from the war. The fact that it had only been 15 years since the end of the war in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. President Eisenhower planned on flying to Japan, and he was going to sign the treaty in person. And this was a big diplomatic thing that the United States was hoping to do. There were huge riots in Japan. Wasn't it like Hokkaido was like occupied in Tokyo or something? The demonstrators actually went into the Diet building, and anyway, the trip was like called off at the last minute or something. Basically, Eisenhower was almost on his way to Andrews Air Force Base, and they decided that it just wasn't safe for the president to come here. So it's kind of amazing that from those beginnings, when it was so very controversial, it has now become what it is today, such a strong alliance. Doesn't matter whether it's Democrat or Republican in the United States, our policy tends to be very, very constant toward Japan. As we always say, the U.S.-Japan security relationship is the bedrock or cornerstone, ishizui desu, the cornerstone of U.S. security policy in East Asia. This is the treaty, and a few details about the treaty. And the main part of the treaty here, as you can see, Article 5, each party recognizes that an armed attack against either party in the territories under the administration of Japan would be dangerous to its own peace and safety, and declares that it would act to meet the common danger. This part right here is very important. In the territories under the administration of Japan. And this has been interpreted in different ways. And the reason that this is so important and that this is so different is that this treaty is very unique among security treaties. The United States has an obligation to defend Japan against attack if Japan or any territories controlled by Japan are attacked by an enemy. That obligation is not mutual necessarily. An attack upon U.S. forces that are in Japan, then the Japanese are obligated to work with the United States in order to commonly and collectively defend Japan. But an attack upon United States territory, United States forces outside of Japan, there is no obligation for Japan to come to the defense of the United States. So you see what I mean there. The United States is always obligated to defend Japan. If somebody attacked California, if somebody attacked Hawaii, if there was an attack on American interest, any place else in the world, there is no obligation for Japan to come to the defense of the United States. So it's slightly different. You can compare that with the NATO alliance and the NATO treaty, which is a collective defense treaty. In the NATO treaty, it says that an attack upon any of the member countries of the NATO alliance is an attack upon all of the countries in the NATO alliance. In some bizarre world, when Denmark is attacked, every single NATO member has to come to the defense of Denmark, vice versa. So very, very different. And it comes into play a lot when we're engaging with the Japanese in different ways. Japanese Constitution, Article 9. Are you all familiar with Article 9? Yep. And of course, the Americans basically wrote Article 9, and now we have to deal with it ever since. And Article 9 has been interpreted in different ways, but of course, Article 9 is kind of the pacifism article. Basically, that Japan is never going to have armed forces, literally. That's what it says in the article, and that Japan forever, what is the phrase, renounces war as a means of state policy. The only, maybe not the only country, one of the only countries in the world with this type of clause, I think Iceland has a similar clause in its constitution. The United States has also responsibility for the military defense of Iceland. I believe that Costa Rica also is cited as a country that has one of these no war clauses. And amazingly, the United States is also obligated to defend Costa Rica in the event of any kind of a conflict there. This is always being reinterpreted. The first big reinterpretation for the Japanese, of course, was to allow Japan, fairly early on, to create a military and to create the self-defense forces so that Japan could defend itself, even though, of course, the self-defense forces are not really supposed to operate outside of Japan in any aggressive manner. And we see that every time Japan is thinking of participating in some type of peacekeeping operation abroad or in some type of military operation abroad, becomes a big political issue. There has to be special legislation. You typically have a lot of opposition to that, etc. We see that again and again with Japan. Over the years, Article 9 has been interpreted more broadly. As most of you probably know, there are periodic discussions about revising Article 9 to go ahead and make it easier for Japan to simply participate in collective self-defense with the United States, for example. That's an ongoing issue. It seems to kind of come and go during the Koizumi period. There was a lot of talk about Article 9 revision. I don't hear very much about it anymore for the last few years. Maybe if we have an LDP government coming in, perhaps if you have some more conservative, some more conservative politicians coming in after the next election, there could be some talk about Article 9 revision again. But I think that's probably far off at this point. Japanese public support for maintaining the alliance, it is very strong. We have a very good relationship in most places with local communities. There are some problems, obviously. Okinawa, obviously, is a place where there are always issues about basing and local area issues. Especially in the wake of Operation Tomodachi, support for the U.S.-Japan alliance is very high. I believe that after 3/11, rather, the public opinion polling was showing general support for the alliance at about, what was it, 86% or something? The highest it had ever been. It's pretty amazing when you consider that most new Japanese governments start off at, what, about a 30 or 40% approval rate and then kind of quickly go down from there. Fortunately for our countries, despite the real issues and differences of agreement that we have periodically, the overall support for the alliance throughout the years has been very strong. And if this goes back to 97, you went back to the 80s, you went back to the 70s, it would be more or less the same. In the early days that I mentioned, it was obviously much lower, but it kind of climbed up, and I think that at this point, we typically say about 3/4 of the Japanese public understand and agree with maintaining the alliance. Latest big example of cooperation, Secretary Panetta, American Secretary of Defense. He was here a week ago, and he met with his counterpart, Morimoto Shi. He met with the Foreign Minister, Genba. I participated in some of those meetings. They had a joint press conference afterward. And again, these meetings between U.S. and Japan top officials are very, very frequent. and it's a very good thing. Whether it's Panetta, Secretary Clinton, Japanese officials going to the United States, I think U.S. and Japanese officials at this level and maybe one level below meet with each other as frequently, if not more frequently, than top officials of any two countries in the world. So it's a very positive thing. Makes it very difficult for me to Embassy Tokyo because I have to do a lot of logistical stuff to support this. So I get to work like all night long, usually for a couple of days. But it's a good thing for the two countries, even though it's a really bad thing for me and my section as far as the hours that we have to put in. And there were some important announcements that they made. They were able to announce that the MV-22 Osprey issue that has kind of dominated the press lately has been resolved to the extent that the Japanese government reaffirmed the safety of the Osprey, and the Ospreys are flying now in Iwakuni. They also announced that the two countries are engaged in discussions or negotiations for additional, what do we call it, X-band radar, the ballistic missile defense radar systems that can detect, these missiles from North Korea or whatever, and establishing additional sites in the future for these sophisticated new missile defense radar systems. Okay, U.S. forces, Japan, that's a little bit about the alliance. This is what the United States force structure looks like right now. Pretty small army presence. Most of the army in the region is in Korea. So 2,530, a few of those are here up north, not in Hokkaido, but in Aomori-ken. Most of the army presence is a headquarters element, which is down in the Tokyo area. It's the headquarters for I Corps. I Corps is the U.S. Corps that's in Korea, and the headquarters element is actually here in Japan. Navy, 6,800, Air Force, 11,000, Marine Corps, 17,000, and of course, most of the Marines are down in Okinawa. The Navy figure is a little low because, as you can see, right underneath, we have 7th Fleet at sea, so about 12,000 sailors that at any given point in time are actually out on the ships that are in the region. When they come back to Yokosuka, down by Yokohama, Tokyo area, then the population of sailors goes up very quickly. So about 50,000 uniform service, 5,000, 6,000, give or take a bit, civilians that are working for the Defense Department. Some of those people can be people like me that are working on policy issues, and that could be anything. There are technical specialists, contractors that are working on all different types of things. So it's a very diverse workforce. Then a lot of family members too. For the United States, one of the good things about serving in Japan and having people here is that it's a nice, safe, stable country so that family members are able to come here. So lots of spouses, male and female spouses, lots of kids. There is a big DoD school system, Defense Department school system. So all of these bases have high schools and junior highs and elementary schools, etc. And that's a really nice thing that you have that family dynamic. I spent a long time in Iraq, and I was embedded with an artillery unit, Army artillery unit. And obviously, during that period of time, I was not with my wife and kids because I'm not going to have any dependents in a place like Iraq, obviously. And there are some other bases where it's difficult for dependents to go as well. So total 100,000, 102,000, give or take a few thousand. It's a very, very large footprint that we have here in Japan. And I think that we are always aware of that. Always aware of the fact that we are guests in Japan, that we are guests in this community, and 100,000 crazy, out of control Americans, etc., concentrated in a relatively few areas. This has a real impact upon Japan and upon the local communities. Japanese forces or Japanese employees, also 26,000. So that's kind of a good news story. This is also a lot of economic activity for Japan. And if you think about the downstream consequences or effects of those 26,000 Japanese employees. It's a lot of money that's pumped into the local economy by labor, by contracts for everything from food to equipment to vehicles, etc. You see different figures about the percentage of gross domestic product that the U.S. forces actually put into Japan, but it's fairly significant. You know, you're talking about billions of dollars a year in one form or another, directly or indirectly, that goes into the Japanese economy, especially in Okinawa, especially in Okinawa. U.S. military installations. This is only a few of them. There are some that are quite small, but going over the big ones that most of you all probably already know about, obviously. Okay. Let's advance again. Starting off down in Okinawa, of course, you've got the Futenma, the controversial Futenma Air Station that you all know about, Marine Air Station for helos. Kadena is the Air Force base down there, and a few others. Camp Schwab's a big base up in the northern part of the island. Iwakuni down here, close to Fukuoka, let's say. This is another Marine Corps air station. That's where the MV-22s are right now and where they are flying. And in a few years, we are going to see all of the airplanes for the aircraft carrier George Washington. When they're not out in the ocean on the carrier, they're actually on land most of the time. They don't just keep them on the ship. And they fly out of Atsugi. And Atsugi is down near Tokyo. And this is part of a realignment package we're working on now. They're all going to move from Atsugi to Iwakuni. And that is going to become the new home for the aircraft carrier airwing. So Seibu Naval Base, down there. Of course, we've got Yokosuka, the big 7th Fleet base in close to the Yokohama area, etc. So all up and down. Misawa, as you all know, very close to where you are. 35th Air Wing in Misawa. All up and down Japan, we've got a few larger bases and then a lot of small facilities. Sometimes the facility might be something like a radar station where there's only 10 people or 12 Americans. Very, very small. And unless you're right in that local community, you don't even know it's there. And we tend to have very small little groups of people all over the country in places like that most people are unaware of. Air Force in Japan. Well, I've already spoken a little bit about that, I guess. Kadena, Misawa, maybe the two better known Air Force bases. Yokota, which is outside of Tokyo again, is the headquarters of all of U.S. Forces Japan and the headquarters of the 5th Force. It's a very large presence. We've got all types of planes. F-22s, the newest plane, will come here on periodic deployments from time to time. A lot of F-16s. I think most of the planes in Misawa, where I was, are the F-16s. And the Japanese Air Force is on Misawa too. So it's a joint base, U.S. and Japanese. So they've got their F-16 equivalents there. A lot of planes down on Kadena, on Okinawa as well. Some of these planes will also deploy for a certain period of time in Afghanistan and Iraq. And a lot of the guys from Misawa right now are in Afghanistan. Hello. Navy, and there we go. A friendly word from the aircraft carrier as it sails into vehicles. Hello, nice to meet you. And this is, I guess this is the George Washington. Can you see the number on there? Is it 73? Sign, right. Right there. So this is the George Washington. This is the aircraft carrier. It is the only aircraft carrier that the United States has anywhere in the world that is permanently based outside of the United States. And it is based in Yokosuka. It's a fascinating vessel. 6,000 people work on it, live on it when it is out at sea. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but this incredible amount of like meals per day and water that is utilized and purified through a desalinization system from seawater and stuff like that. It's really incredible. It has a full complement of F-18 fighters and other fighter aircraft, and it really is the centerpiece of America's military efforts in this part of the Pacific and of the 7th Fleet. And it has typically a group of ships around it, 12, 13, 14 other vessels that compose the group that George Washington works with. Seems like it's out at sea about half the time, and about half the time it's in Japan or around Japan. Army in Japan, pretty small presence as I mentioned. We've got the headquarters unit down at Camp Zama, and some of the ballistic missile defense sites, radar sites, etc., anti-missile systems are also operated by the Army. Marine Corps down in Okinawa, of course, there's one of the old CH-46 helicopters that is being replaced by the MV-22 actually. The slide you saw, 17,000 Marines down in Okinawa. Maybe if they were up to full strength, there are that many. Of course, many of the Marines are in Iraq and Afghanistan, or in Afghanistan now. So for about the past 10 years, the actual population of Marines in Okinawa has been significantly lower. Okinawa. So most of the more difficult issues, it seems, that we deal with as far as our alliance tend to deal with Okinawa because Okinawa is, of course, a small island. Strategically located, a beautiful place. Here we have Okinawa. You can see the radius right here that the current Marine Expeditionary Force, the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force, is able to cover. Basically, if you were looking at scenarios like something taking place with North Korea, if you're looking at a China Straits contingency, if you're looking at sea lanes somehow being blocked, the location of Okinawa, where it is, so close to Japan, so close to other actors in the region, close to North Korea, etc. There really isn't, from a strategic standpoint, that many other places where U.S. forces and Japanese forces as well could really go in order to maintain the type of readiness that they need to defend Japan against these different regional possibilities. Saipan, this is a U.S. possession too, but you can see how far away Saipan is. Guam, of course, is like way down here, right? And a bunch of Marines are going to go to Guam. We are building up on Guam so that we can reduce our impact upon Okinawa and get a lot of Marines out of there and give some of the bases back to the Japanese and really get out of the southern part of Okinawa to the extent possible so that it's not so difficult for the local people. But we can only do that to a certain extent just because of geography. Because Okinawa is way up here, Guam's right on there. Marines on Okinawa can be anywhere in this region, like during Operation Tomodachi, in 6 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours, 20 hours. Marines in Guam, like 2 or 3 days. Marines in California, a week and a half. So to really be able to respond quickly to a contingency, especially humanitarian assistance type contingency, like Tomodachi and like the earthquake, it just doesn't really work if you have the people all the way back in the United States. Some policy issues, realignment roadmap. I've referred to this a little bit already. We have different things that we're doing right now with the Japanese. We call it our realignment package. Very complicated. I've already mentioned the main parts of it really. Okay. We're going to be moving from Atsugi to Iwakuni. So all of the carrier air wing, all the planes that are on the aircraft carrier usually, instead of being here, will be located here when they're not in the carrier. As I mentioned, a bunch of the bases will be returned, either all of them or parts of them, just to the local communities. And the plan is to try to move the big marine air station, Futenma, up here to Henoko, Mochiiki, Henoko area, and it is a largely uninhabited area. There is a little town, Henoko, right there. It's pretty small though, and I've been there a few times, but there's really not anything around it. So it's pretty isolated up there. If any of you have been to Okinawa, you know Futenma is just right in the middle of everything. It's right in the middle of the main part of the island. The communities have grown over the years, and so they have grown up to where they are right on the edge of the airfield. Some people sometimes have a little bit of a misunderstanding about that, and they will say, well, why did the United States put this airfield here in the middle of, you know, the most populated area of Okinawa? There was nothing there when the airfield was put in. And you know, you can see the pictures. It is surrounded by empty farmland and hills and stuff back in the 50s when it was actually, or late 40s. So it's over time that the population has grown and it's kind of built up. And that's a major part of our realignment package, is to try to take care of that. And you can see all the rest of it, all these different things, and this is much of what I deal with at a policy level. Negotiating with the Japanese, negotiating with local communities about all of these different moves and all of these different parts, and trying to come up with a way to make, hopefully, most of this at least happen during my career, during a reasonable time frame. And most of it designed to reduce our footprint in Japan, but also to maintain the strategic capability that we need. Okay, regional global context for the alliance, old threats to the alliance. The U.S.-Japan alliance, obviously, was formed during the Cold War. That was the initial reason for it, against the Soviet Union, protecting Japan, part of that entire global dynamic. The U.S.-Japan alliance, I think, has done much better post-Cold War than, say, NATO has. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO in some ways, I mean, it's, you know, there's a reason and a purpose. It's a good thing that European countries are together, bound together in a military alliance. If for no other reason, then it brings them together and it tends to reduce the possibility of any future conflicts, right? It's a good thing that Germany is a part of NATO. It's a good thing that Germany and France are integrated together in the European Union. So there are reasons for an alliance like NATO that are really internal political reasons, internal to European politics. The external dynamic of NATO, Russia, kind of. Russia's not really the strategic threat that it was, obviously, during the Cold War period. NATO's in Afghanistan, yeah, that's good, that's a positive thing. But the rationale for NATO has changed a lot more than the rationale for the U.S.-Japan alliance, because, of course, the new regional security context in Asia is also very difficult. North Korea is North Korea, and North Korea has a tendency to like to shoot missiles at Japan and over Japan and shell South Korea and sink South Korean vessels and just do things that a rational actor doesn't tend to do. And it has a very opaque or unclear leadership, a very unclear military dynamic, and it's a real threat to regional stability. Much of what we do with Japan, especially ballistic missile defense, it's all about protecting Japan against North Korea. And again, you know, many people will say, well, yeah, do you really think that North Korea would send a missile to Japan? You know, they like to shoot it over Japan and do this kind of stuff to show that they have the capability, but why would they do this? Well, again, number one, it's not a rational actor, and number two, a missile that is launched by North Korea, how many of those have failed? Simply because they intended to go up and over or near Japan doesn't necessarily mean that that is where it's going to go. And so we're always very concerned about the possibility of the North Koreans doing something that is intended as a provocation but gets out of control, where we have to react to make sure that it does not come down in a populated area somewhere in Japan or elsewhere in the region. 21st century, we can talk a little bit about terrorism. I think you all are familiar with that. Other regional threats, rise of China. I don't want to belabor this too much. The U.S.-Japan alliance is not directed against China. I think we try to make that very, very clear. The United States does not view a rising China as a threat necessarily, and we don't have a containment policy against China. Is there concern about a lack of transparency in China's political system, in their current political transition, in Chinese military and military spending? Well, of course there is. And that's not just an American concern, it's a Japanese concern, it's a Vietnamese concern, it's a concern everywhere across the region. One of the real concerns that we have also when we talk about lack of transparency is the fact that the budgetary figures that the Chinese tend to announce are so unrealistic with what everyone in the region really knows, what they're spending on defense. I think both Japan and the US, pretty transparent. You can go online and in about 60 seconds, more or less find out what the US spends on defense and what we're purchasing. Same thing for Japan. As you can see, the gap between what China reports and what is actually being spent and what it's being spent on is pretty big and pretty huge. And we're talking billions of dollars, of course. And there are some new things that we're working on. Here's the ballistic missile defense system I've talked about, radar systems, etc. Anti-piracy cooperation. Japan is working in the Horn of Africa area and elsewhere on this type of bizarre piracy threat that has arisen in the past decade or so and has been able to interpret its constitution to allow it to do that. That's a good thing. And we have quite a few different processes, space dialogue, cybersecurity, all of these new issues of the day driven by technology that Japan and the United States are working on, working together. And briefly we'll mention Operation Tomodachi, the biggest success story we had. And just a few statistics for you. After the earthquake, about 20,000 of those 50,000 U.S. personnel were involved in Tomodachi. Almost every aircraft that we have in Japan, virtually the entire 7th Fleet, millions of gallons of water, tens of thousands of tons of food and other supplies, and a lot of people evacuated also, and taken out of the Tohoku region, taken to hospitals, taken to shelters, etc. Even more than, well, the water was pretty important, but even more than some of the other supplies, I think the ability to get people out quickly that were seriously injured, people that are elderly, kids, etc., who basically had no shelter whatsoever and were injured, kind of out, going into shock. That quick ability, in particular we talked about Marines and elements like that, being able to get there so fast, actually come in and land on the ground and then get out again was a really great success story. Japanese self-defense forces, I mean, they're the main heroes and they're the real heroes and they really showed what they're capable of, but we're very proud that U.S. forces were able to play a role there as well. It's probably the best thing that we've been able to do in Japan. And as you can see, it's like all over the place, so a bunch of stuff going on during Tomodachi. I've already explained the embassy role and our role, so we'll skip over that. And I think we'll start the official part of the presentation, about the halfway mark, so that's a good thing. So that is a very brief and simple overview of U.S. Force in Japan, alliance, and the type of issues that we're working on. And I'll be pleased to answer some questions about that and about anything else.
Okay, first let's thank our speaker.